I watched my elderly billionaire husband gasp for air on the cold floor of the wine cellar, clutching his chest and begging for help. But instead of calling 911, my lover, his own head of security, calmly locked the door and kissed me while the old man took his last breaths. We drank his vintage whiskey and celebrated our victory, in his bed that very night, convinced we had pulled off the perfect crime. I thought I was the new queen of the empire, until the bedroom door opened the next morning, and my blood turned to ice. The morning sun of the modern metropolis pierced through the floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows of the 45th floor, flooding the master bedroom with a light so white and sterile it felt almost surgical. I sat motionless before the vanity mirror, my reflection framed by the sprawling skyline of steel and glass behind me, watching dispassionately as the makeup artist applied the final, microscopic touches to a face that was already statistically perfect. The room was suffocated by the heavy, cloying scent of expensive hothouse lilies mixed with the chemical tang of professional hairspray, a combination that smelled distinctively of wealth and artificial preservation. I barely breathed, trained to be a canvas, while the brush swept over my cheekbones with the lightness of a moth's wing. In this aquarium of glass and money, silence was not empty. It was a heavy, expensive substance that filled the corners of the room, insulating us from the dirty, noisy reality of the streets nearly half a mile below. Arthur stood by the window, his back turned to the domestic scene, a silhouette against the blinding brightness of the morning sky. He was speaking into his phone, his voice a low rhythmic drone discussing the hostile merger of two media giants, calculating lives and fortunes with the same emotional detachment one might use to order coffee. He wore a suit that had been tailored in London, cut so precisely that it almost successfully hid the slight, inevitable slouch that crept into his posture by the end of the trading week. He was 55 years old, and like the Swiss watches he collected, he was impeccably maintained, astronomically expensive, and utterly predictable. To him, I was just another asset in the room, perhaps the most beautiful one, but an asset nonetheless, requiring maintenance and protection just like his stock portfolio. I watched his reflection in the mirror, a man who owned everything he saw, yet seemed to look at nothing. I raised a slender hand to touch the diamond necklace resting against my throat, the stones cold and heavy against my warm skin. It was an early gift for our second anniversary, which would arrive tomorrow, a glittering collar that signaled my status to the world while reminding me of who held the leash. Everything in this morning scene was saturated with a terrifying sense of calm and symmetry, from the quiet, engineered hum of the central air conditioning to the plush, forgiving softness of the white carpet that swallowed all sound. There was no chaos here, no passion, only the smooth, frictionless slide of extreme privilege. I felt a sudden, fleeting desire to scream, just to see if the sound would shatter the glass, but I suppressed it instantly, smoothing the silk of my robe instead. I was part of the decor, and the decor does not scream. It sits and sparkles and waits to be admired by guests. The phone call ended with a curt disconnect, and Arthur turned, the mask of the ruthless businessman softening into the mild, absent expression of a husband. He walked over to me, his leather shoes making no sound, and pressed a dry, perfunctory kiss to the top of my head, careful not to disturb the work of the makeup artist. He informed me that the jet was fueled and we would be flying to the Hamptons that evening for the weekend, a statement that was phrased as information rather than a question. He checked his watch, satisfied with the schedule of his life, and walked out of the bedroom, leaving the heavy mahogany door slightly ajar behind him. The vacuum of his presence was immediate, leaving me alone with my reflection and the lingering scent of his cologne, a sharp metallic smell that reminded me of vaults and ink. I let out a long, controlled sigh, the first genuine breath I had taken in an hour, and reached for the crystal glass of lemon water sitting on the vanity. My fingers were inches from the glass when the rhythm of the morning was shattered by a sound that did not belong in this sanctuary of softness. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoing from the hallway. They were not the hushed steps of the maids or the polished tread of my husband. They were the boots of a predator. The door, which Arthur had left open, was pushed wide, and a massive figure filled the frame, blocking out the light from the corridor. It was Marcus, the new head of security hired only 3 days ago, a man whose sheer physical density seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. He did not knock. He did not ask for permission. He simply stood there, a dark monolith against the white walls, radiating a raw, unpolished energy that clashed violently with the delicate atmosphere of the penthouse. I froze, my hand hovering in mid-air, my eyes locking onto him through the mirror. Marcus did not apologize for the intrusion. Instead, his gaze, heavy and uncomfortably tactile, slid over my form with a slowness that felt like a physical touch. He looked at the silk robe I wore, his eyes tracing the fabric down to where it had slipped open to reveal the curve of my thigh, lingering there for a second longer than any employee would dare. He didn't look away when I turned to face him. He simply nodded, a gesture that was devoid of respect, and reached out to pull the door shut. But just before the latch clicked, I saw it, a flash in his dark eyes that was not professional diligence, but a cold, predatory mockery. It was the look of a wolf assessing a sheep in a golden pen. A shiver of ice ran down my spine, destroying the morning's warmth and replacing the sterile safety of the penthouse with a sudden, suffocating sense of danger. Boredom in that penthouse was not merely a state of mind. It was a physical substance, thick and suffocating, hanging in the recycled air like invisible dust that settled into the pores of my skin. It was the kind of ennui that only exists where survival is guaranteed, a luxury problem that felt like a slow asphyxiation. The days bled into one another, forming a seamless gray loop of perfection that offered no friction and no escape. I spent my waking hours drifting from room to room, trailing my fingers over surfaces that cost more than my parents' entire lifetime earnings, cool Italian marble, rough-hewn sculptures imported from Bali, and velvet upholstery that seemed to swallow sound. I felt less like the mistress of the house and more like its most expensive acquisition, a rare exotic bird clipped of its wings and placed in a gilded aviary to be admired but never heard. I would catch my reflection in the miles of glass that surrounded us. A slender, beautiful ghost wandering through a private museum where touching the exhibits was permitted, but feeling them was impossible. The silence of the apartment was absolute, a heavy, expensive quiet that pressed against my eardrums, broken only by the distant rhythmic thrum of the city 45 stories below, a world I could see but could no longer touch. In this vacuum of activity, Marcus became the only variable, a dark anomaly in my white, sterile universe. He was everywhere, a constant looming shadow that moved with a predatory grace at the periphery of my vision. The official reason for his suffocating proximity was a series of corporate threats leveled against Arthur's conglomerate, vague whispers of kidnapping plots or leverage plays by rival firms that necessitated enhanced protocol. But as the days wore on, the security detail felt less like protection and more like surveillance. He followed me with a persistence that bordered on obsession, standing guard while I ate my solitary lunches, waiting outside the door while I bathed, his presence vibrating through the wood. He was a visual shock against the minimalist decor, his massive frame clad in black tactical gear or dark suits that strained against his musculature, creating a stark, violent contrast to the beige and cream palette of my prison. I began to feel that his eyes were not scanning the perimeter for threats, but were dissecting me, peeling back the layers of my designer clothing to evaluate the woman beneath, cataloging my flaws and my fears with the cold precision of a butcher eyeing a prime cut. One Tuesday afternoon, when the silence of the house had become particularly unbearable, I sought refuge in the only place that offered a different kind of darkness. Arthur was away at a marathon board meeting that would likely stretch into the night, leaving me to govern a kingdom of empty rooms. I descended the floating staircase to the lower level, my bare feet sinking into the deep pile of the carpet, and pushed open the heavy, soundproof double doors of the home cinema. The room was a cavern of cool, recirculated air and plush leather, illuminated only by the faint blue standby lights of the projection equipment. It was a space designed for escapism, sealed off from the intrusion of daylight, a place where reality was suspended. I didn't turn on a movie. I didn't want the noise. I simply wanted to sit in the dark and pretend, for a moment, that I was somewhere else, anywhere else. But as the heavy doors clicked shut behind me, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I knew with an instinct that bypassed logic entirely, that I was not alone. The air in the room shifted, displaced by a heavy heat-radiating mass. I didn't need to turn around to know that Marcus was there. His presence was a physical weight, a gravitational pull that warped the atmosphere of the room. He had followed me down, silent as a phantom, and taken up his position. I could feel him standing by the exit, guarding the only way out, blocking my retreat with his body. I sat in one of the front recliners for a few minutes, staring at the blank silver screen, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It was a game we were playing, a silent, dangerous dance of hunter and prey, though I wasn't entirely sure which role I had been cast in. The tension was electric, crackling in the cool air, charging the space between us with unsaid words and forbidden thoughts. I couldn't sit still. The darkness, which I had sought for comfort, now felt charged and intimate, stripping away the social barriers that existed upstairs in the sunlight. I stood up, my legs trembling slightly, and turned to face the back of the room. He was there, just as I had pictured him, leaning against the doorframe with a casual arrogance that infuriated and enthralled me. His arms were crossed over his chest, the black fabric of his t-shirt strained to the breaking point by the swelling muscles of his biceps. In the gloom he looked like a monolith, a creature carved from midnight in stone. I began to walk toward him, moving slowly up the aisle between the seats. I told myself I was going to the wet bar near the entrance to get a glass of water, a flimsy pretext that neither of us believed. As I drew closer, the details of him resolved in the shadows, the sharp angle of his jaw, the shaved precision of his hair, and those eyes. Even in the dark they glittered with a cold, dangerous fire, tracking my approach with an intensity that made my knees weak. I was walking into the lion's den, driven by a reckless, self-destructive urge to poke the beast, to see if I could make it roar. I wanted to prove that here in my husband's house, I was the one holding the whip. Our connection did not grow with the slow, tentative roots of a romance. It exploded like a wildfire in a drought, consuming everything in its path with a speed that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The penthouse, once a sprawling cathedral of silence and observation, transformed into a clandestine map of shadows and blind spots. Marcus knew the geometry of the surveillance system better than the architects who had designed the building. He knew exactly where the camera lenses flared from the afternoon sun, rendering them blind for 12 minutes a day. He knew which corners of the walk-in wardrobes were swallowed by shadows, and which corridors had a 3-second delay on the motion sensors. We lived in these gaps, inhabiting the slivers of unobserved space like rats scurrying behind the walls of a palace. It was a frantic, desperate geography of lust, played out against the backdrop of my husband's oblivious routine. Every stolen touch was a calculated risk, a high-stakes gamble that made my heart hammer against my ribs until I felt dizzy with the adrenaline. The fear of discovery wasn't a deterrent. It was the fuel. It turned every encounter into a life-or-death scenario, sharpening my senses until the smell of Marcus's skin and the rough texture of his uniform were the only things that felt real in a world of plastic and glass. This was not merely sex. It was a violent, visceral insurrection against the sterile purity of my marriage. For 2 years, I had lived in a world of hushed tones and careful movements, treating my body like a loaned artifact that had to be returned in mint condition. Arthur touched me with the reverence of a collector handling a rare vase, gentle, precise, and utterly devoid of passion. He made love with the lights off and the door locked, a clinical procedure that left me feeling cold and hollow. Marcus was the antidote to that suffocation. He was rough, demanding, and unapologetically physical. He didn't ask for permission. He took what he wanted with a primal authority that shattered my composure. When his hands gripped my waist, they left bruises that I traced later in the mirror like secret tattoos, evidence that I was made of flesh and blood, not porcelain. I melted under this raw force, craving the weight of him, the friction, the sheer undeniable reality of his desire. It was a degradation that felt like liberation, a way to soil the pristine white canvas of my life with something messy and human. One suffocating night in late August, the atmosphere in the penthouse shifted from tension to conspiracy. Arthur had retired early, complaining of the palpitations that had been plaguing him with increasing frequency. I watched him swallow his nightly cocktail of beta blockers and sedatives, his hand trembling slightly as he lifted the glass of water. He looked old, frail, a paper man fading into the high thread count sheets. Once the heavy rhythm of his drug-induced snoring filled the master suite, I slipped out of bed and into the guest room down the hall, a space I ostensibly used for reading when I couldn't sleep. The air conditioning was humming its low, artificial note, but the room felt hot, heavy with anticipation. I didn't have to wait long. The door handle turned silently, the lock-picking mechanism clicking with a sound no louder than a breaking twig. Marcus slipped inside, bringing the darkness of the hallway with him. He didn't turn on the light. He didn't need to. In the gloom, he was a massive heat-radiating presence that instantly dominated the space. We came together with the frantic urgency that had become our rhythm, a silent collision of bodies in the dark. But afterward, as our breathing slowed and the sweat cooled on my skin, the dynamic in the room changed. Usually, Marcus would leave immediately, retreating to his quarters to maintain the illusion of security. Tonight he stayed. He lay beside me, his arm heavy across my chest, staring up at the invisible ceiling. The silence stretched thick and pregnant until he broke it. His voice was a low rumble, a vibration that traveled through his chest and into my spine. He didn't speak of us or of the risk we were taking. He spoke of Arthur. He started listing the medications on Arthur's nightstand with the precision of a pharmacist, detailing their interactions and side effects. He spoke of the fragility of the human heart, specifically an aging heart that was already under strain. It was a cold clinical recitation that chilled me more than the air conditioning ever could. "He's running on borrowed time, Alice," Marcus whispered, his lips brushing against my ear in the darkness. "But borrowing can take a long time. 10 years. 15. Can you imagine?" The question hung in the air, a poisonous vapor. He painted a picture of my future that was stark and terrifying. He described me changing bedpans, pushing a wheelchair, wasting the prime of my beauty acting as a glorified nurse for a man who treated me like an acquisition. He spoke of the prenuptial agreement, the clauses that tied my inheritance to the duration of the marriage, the possibility that Arthur might live long enough to get bored and trade me in for a newer model before I saw a dime. He played on my vanity, my greed, and my deepest unspoken fears. I lay there, listening to the steady thud of his heart, and felt the walls of the room closing in. The golden cage suddenly felt very small and very inescapable. Then, the conversation shifted from diagnosis to prescription. The idea he planted was simple, brutal, and terrifyingly elegant. We didn't need to use a weapon. We didn't need to stage an accident that would invite police scrutiny. We simply needed to let nature take its course with a little encouragement. "Stress," Marcus murmured, his hand tracing the line of my throat. "Cortisol is a poison to a heart like his. We don't protect him anymore. We push him." The plan unfolded in the dark like a blooming nightshade. We would subject Arthur to excessive physical exertion, manipulate his schedule to deprive him of sleep, and create crises in his business that would send his blood pressure skyrocketing. And then the coup de grace, a subtle adjustment to his medication, swapping his heart pills for placebos, or perhaps something that would accelerate his pulse rather than slow it. It would look like a tragedy, a sudden cardiac event brought on by the stress of his high-powered life. The doctors would shake their heads and say it was inevitable. The world would mourn the titan of industry, and I would be the grieving billionaire widow. I listened, and I should have been horrified. I should have pushed him away, turned on the light, and called the police. But I didn't. The words washed over me like a dark baptism. In the safety of the dark, with the warmth of his body shielding me from the cold reality of morality, the plan didn't sound like murder. It sounded like justice. It sounded like a way to reclaim the years I had sold. I thought of Arthur's dismissive tone, his cold hands, the way he looked through me. I thought of the freedom Marcus was offering. A life where I answered to no one, where I possessed the power and the money. I convinced myself that I was the one making the choice, that I was using this brute force to break the lock on my chains. I placed my hand over Marcus's heart, feeling the powerful, steady rhythm that contrasted so sharply with my husband's fluttering pulse, and I whispered a single word of agreement. It was a pact sealed in sweat and shadows. I believed in that moment that I was the architect of my own destiny, the femme fatale in a noir film who manipulates the hired muscle to do her bidding. I didn't realize then that by saying yes, I hadn't gained a partner. I had gained a handler. I felt a surge of triumph, a rush of dopamine that was more potent than the sex had been. I was no longer the passive object, the vase on the shelf. I was a player in the game. I nestled closer to him, resting my head on his shoulder, mistaking the weight of his arm pinning me down for an embrace of protection. I closed my eyes and visualized the funeral, the black veil, the reading of the will. I didn't see the trap closing around my own ankle. I didn't see that in conspiring to kill the master of the house, I had simply traded a benevolent jailer for a ruthless one. But in the dark, with the promise of billions whispering in my ear, the difference felt irrelevant. I was ready to kill the king. The stage for our final act was set on a Saturday night, disguised as the annual foundation for the arts gala held within the sprawling confines of our penthouse. The apartment had been transformed into a shimmering theater of philanthropy and excess, crowded with the city's elite who drank vintage champagne and pretended to care about tax-deductible causes. I was the centerpiece of the evening, dressed in a gown of crimson silk that clung to my body like a second skin, a deliberate splash of violence against the room's neutral palette. I felt magnificent and utterly cruel, a venomous flower blooming in the center of the garden. My nerves, which I expected to be frayed, were instead pulled tight and humming with a terrifying electric energy. I moved through the crowd with Arthur on my arm, playing the role of the devoted trophy wife, but beneath the surface, I was the conductor of an orchestra designed to play a funeral march. Tonight was not about charity, it was about acceleration. We were going to push the engine of Arthur's heart until it seized, and every smile I bestowed upon a guest was merely a tightening of the screw. The plan required a precise choreography of stress, and I led Arthur through the steps with a ruthless efficiency. The band was playing a frenetic up-tempo jazz set, the kind of music that makes the pulse race just by listening to it. I dragged Arthur onto the dance floor, ignoring his subtle protests and the sheen of perspiration already forming on his upper lip. He was a man who preferred the sidelines, but I insisted, laughing loudly and pulling him into the center of the room. I made him spin me, dip me, keeping him in constant motion for song after song. I could feel the tremor in his hands and hear the ragged intake of his breath near my ear, but I didn't stop. I whispered in his ear that he looked dashing, that everyone was watching, trapping him in the spotlight of his own vanity. He couldn't leave the floor without looking old or weak, and Arthur would rather die than look weak. So he danced, his face flushing a deep, unhealthy red, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs that I could feel through his jacket. When the music finally paused, I didn't let him rest. I guided him toward the bar, intercepting a waiter carrying a tray of heavy crystal tumblers. Arthur's doctors had been explicit. No strong spirits, only the occasional glass of red wine. But tonight the doctors weren't here. I handed him a double scotch, neat, the amber liquid glinting under the chandelier lights. To us, I toasted, my eyes wide and challenging. He hesitated, looking at the glass with a mixture of longing and fear, knowing it was poison for his condition. But the pressure of the room, the eyes of his competitors, and my expectant smile were too much. He drank it down in 2 large swallows, the alcohol acting as an immediate accelerant to his already elevated blood pressure. I watched his throat work, feeling a surge of dark satisfaction. It was so easy. He was a man built on discipline, yet he crumbled instantly under the weight of social expectation and his wife's encouragement. The physical exertion and the alcohol were merely the prelude. The true weapon was emotional volatility. I steered him through the room like a shark herding prey, guiding him directly into the path of his most hated business rivals. I found the CEO of the rival media conglomerate, a man Arthur despised with a biblical intensity, and orchestrated a conversation that I knew would turn toxic. I brought up the merger, feigning innocence, dropping comments that undermined Arthur's position, and hinted that his company was losing its edge. I watched as Arthur's jaw clenched, the veins in his temple throbbing as he engaged in a verbal sparring match that required every ounce of his mental acuity. He was arguing, defending his legacy, getting worked up over market shares and stock prices, while the scotch and the exhaustion churned inside him. He was a machine running in the red, overheating, and I was the one pouring fuel into the tank. From the corner of the room, standing in the shadows of a large marble pillar, Marcus watched. He was technically on duty, scanning the crowd, but I felt his gaze fixed solely on us. His face was a mask of professional indifference, stone cold and unreadable to anyone else, but I knew the code. I saw the slight inclination of his head, the way his eyes tracked Arthur's deteriorating state. It was a look of approval, a silent applause from my co-conspirator. His presence gave me courage. It reminded me that I wasn't alone in this monstrosity, that there was a net waiting to catch me when I jumped. Seeing him there, looking so powerful and composed while my husband sputtered and sweated, solidified my resolve. I wanted to impress him. I wanted to show him that I had the stomach for this, that I was worthy of the dark partnership we had forged in the dark. As the evening reached its crescendo, I decided it was time for the finale. I leaned close to Arthur, gripping his arm with painful force, and whispered that we needed to talk privately. My tone wasn't loving. It was sharp, brittle, laced with a sudden, inexplicable anger. I saw the confusion cloud his eyes, the panic of a man who thought he was managing the night well only to find the ground shifting. I led him away from the noise of the ballroom, through the service corridors, and down the stone steps into the climate-controlled wine cellar. The temperature dropped 20 degrees as we descended, the air becoming thick with the smell of cork and aging oak. The silence down here was profound, a vacuum that swallowed the music from upstairs. We were alone, surrounded by thousands of bottles of wine that Arthur would never live to drink. The moment the heavy wooden door clicked shut, I unleashed the performance of my life. I didn't ease into it, I detonated. I spun around and began to scream at him, my voice echoing off the vaulted brick ceiling. I accused him of things that were entirely fabricated. An affair with his secretary, hiding assets, treating me like a whore. It didn't matter that the accusations were lies. The rage fueling them was real. I poured all my resentment, my boredom, and my hatred into every word. I saw Arthur recoil as if physically struck. He tried to speak, to defend himself, to reason with this sudden madness, but I cut him off, pacing the small room like a caged tiger, throwing my hands up, crying hysterical, dry tears. I needed his heart rate to spike, I needed the cortisol to flood his system, I needed to break him. "You think I don't know?" I shrieked, advancing on him, seeing the color drain completely from his face. "You think you can buy me and then humiliate me?" Arthur staggered back, his hand flying to his chest, his eyes widening in genuine terror. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a wet, gasping sound came out. He stumbled, his shoulder hitting a rack of Bordeaux, the bottles rattling ominously in their cradles. He looked at me with a plea for mercy, for sanity, but I offered neither. I watched as his knees buckled, his hand clutching the lapel of his tuxedo as if trying to rip his own heart out to stop the pain. He slid down the wall, collapsing into a heap on the cold stone floor, his breathing turning into a shallow, desperate rasp. It was happening. The impregnable fortress of Arthur was crumbling. At that precise moment, the heavy door to the cellar opened. A shaft of light from the hallway cut through the gloom, and Marcus stepped inside. For a split second, a flicker of hope crossed Arthur's agony-twisted face. He reached a hand out toward his head of security, his lips moving silently, forming the word help. But Marcus didn't rush to his side. He didn't pull out a radio or check for a pulse. Instead, he turned around and calmly, deliberately, locked the door from the inside. The click of the deadbolt was the loudest sound in the world. It was the sound of a coffin lid closing. Marcus turned back to the room, his eyes passing over the dying man on the floor as if he were nothing more than a discarded coat, and fixed his gaze on me. He walked past Arthur without breaking stride, stepping over his outstretched legs with a casual disrespect that was breathtaking in its cruelty. He came straight to me. I was standing against the far wall, breathless from my screaming, trembling with the aftershocks of the adrenaline. Marcus didn't speak. He reached out and slammed his hands against the wall on either side of my head, trapping me. He pressed his body against mine, hard and demanding, pinning me to the cold bricks. The proximity of death, the man gasping his last breaths just feet away, mixed with the raw animal magnetism of the man pressing against me, created a chemical reaction in my blood that was monstrous and intoxicating. I looked up into Marcus's eyes and saw my own darkness reflected there. We were monsters, both of us, feasting on the carcass of the old king. I looked over Marcus's massive shoulder, my eyes finding Arthur on the floor. He was still conscious, though fading fast. He was watching us. He saw his wife pinned against the wall by his employee. He saw the lack of fear on my face. He saw the intimacy, the conspiracy, the truth. His eyes, wide with the horror of betrayal, met mine. He tried to lift his head, to protest, but his body had failed him. I didn't look away. I didn't feel guilt. I felt a surge of power so absolute it made me dizzy. I was the mistress of life and death, the queen of the cellar. I slowly curved my lips into a smile. A cold, triumphant smile that I wanted to be the last thing he ever saw. I whispered Marcus's name, not as a plea, but as a claim, while the light in my husband's eyes flickered and began to go out. The chaos of the ambulance departure faded slowly, the strobing red and blue lights washing over the walls of the penthouse one last time before disappearing into the urban canyon below. The wail of the sirens, initially a deafening shriek that had cut through the heavy atmosphere of the gala, retreated into the distance, becoming a mournful rhythmic pulse that eventually merged with the hum of the city. I stood in the center of the vast living room, a solitary figure in a crimson dress, surrounded by the debris of the interrupted party. Abandoned crystal flutes still fizzed with warm champagne. Half-eaten canapés sat on silver trays like forgotten offerings, and a silk shawl had been dropped on a chair in the haste of the guests' exodus. The house was quiet, but it was not the stifling, sterile silence that I had loathed for 2 years. This was a new silence, a heavy, vibrating stillness that felt like the atmosphere after a thunderstorm, cleaned by violence and ozone. I was alone, but for the first time in my life, the solitude didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like ownership. I walked to the window, my reflection ghosting against the night sky, and looked down at the streets where my husband was being raced away, presumably to his death. I felt a strange, cold flutter in my chest. Not grief, but the thrilling, terrifying realization that the cage door had been blown off its hinges. I did not have to wait long in that cavernous room. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the salon opened, and Marcus walked in. He did not look like a security guard anymore. The deferential posture and the watchful peripheral gaze were gone, shed like a snake's old skin. He moved with the slow, rolling gait of a man who has just inherited the earth. In his large, steady hands, he carried 2 heavy tumblers of amber liquid, Arthur's Private Reserve, a 50-year-old single malt whiskey that he kept in a locked crystal decanter, forbidden to everyone, especially the staff. The sight of Marcus holding those glasses was more symbolic than any crown. It was a flag planted in conquered territory. He looked at me across the expanse of the room, his face flushed with the aftermath of adrenaline, his eyes dark and triumphant. He looked like a victor returning from the battlefield, still smelling of smoke and iron, coming to claim his spoils. The sight of him broke the dam of tension that had been holding me together for hours. I ran to him. I didn't walk. I abandoned all pretense of poise and threw myself across the room, my heels catching on the expensive rugs. I collided with him, wrapping my arms around his neck, burying my face in the rough fabric of his jacket. A sound tore out of my throat that was half laugh, half sob, a hysterical release of the terror and the exhilaration that had been warring inside me. I was shaking violently, vibrating with a frequency that threatened to shatter my bones. "We did it!" I gasped into his chest, the words wet with tears. "He's gone. Oh my God, Marcus, he's actually gone." I pulled back to look at him, my hands cupping his face, my thumbs tracing the hard line of his jaw. I was manic, drunk on the potency of our crime. I started babbling, the words spilling out of me in a torrent of relieved delirium. I talked about everything and nothing all at once, about how the doctors would never suspect, about how weak Arthur looked, about the way he had fallen. It was a purge, a vomiting up of the poison I had swallowed to survive this marriage. Marcus didn't speak immediately. He simply held me, his arm wrapping around my waist like a steel band, grounding me. He handed me one of the glasses, and I drank the burning liquid in a single gulp, choking slightly as it seared my throat. Tasted like freedom. I began to pace around him, gesturing wildly at the walls, at the art, at the furniture I had always hated. "We're going to change everything," I declared, my voice echoing in the empty hall. "I want to burn this furniture. All of it. Smells like him. We'll get rid of the art, those depressing landscapes he loved. We'll make it bright. We'll make it ours." I grabbed his hand, pulling him toward the window. "And we'll travel. Real travel, Marcus, not those boring business trips where I sit in a hotel room. We'll go to Bali, to the Maldives. We'll disappear for months. Just you and me. No schedules. No pills. No Arthur." I looked up at him, searching his eyes for the reflection of my own joy. He watched me with a small, unreadable smile, his hand stroking my back with a heavy rhythmic pressure that felt comforting and possessive. He was the anchor in my storm, the solid reality that proved this wasn't a dream. The energy in the room shifted from hysterical celebration to something darker and more primal. We didn't need to exchange words to know where we were going. We moved together toward the master suite, walking through the corridors of the penthouse not as sneak thieves or adulterers, but as the new masters of the house. Entering the bedroom felt like crossing a threshold into a new dimension. The bed, Arthur's bed, was made, the sheets pulled tight, the pillows arranged with military precision. The room still held the faint, lingering scent of his sandalwood cologne, and the medicinal tang of his ointments, a ghostly reminder of the man who had occupied this space only hours before. But tonight that smell didn't frighten me. Felt like a trophy. To sleep here, to be together here, was the ultimate desecration, the final act of erasing him from the narrative of my life. I watched Marcus lock the door, a gesture that was no longer about hiding, but about shutting the rest of the world out of our kingdom. We came together on the silk sheets with a desperation that bordered on violence. There was no tenderness in our movements, no slow exploration. It was a reclaiming. Every touch was an assertion of life in the face of the death we had engineered. I clawed at him, needing to feel the weight of him, the heat of his skin, the undeniable reality of his existence. He was so different from Arthur. Where Arthur had been dry paper and brittle bone, Marcus was heavy earth and fire. I lost myself in the sensation of being overwhelmed, of being taken apart and put back together by hands that were strong enough to kill. The act was a blur of shadows and friction, a fever dream where guilt and pleasure merged into a single blinding white light. I cried out, not just from physical sensation but from a profound psychological release. I was shedding the skin of the trophy wife, burning the doll I had been, and rising from the ashes as a woman who had taken control of her destiny. Afterward, the room settled into a heavy, satiated silence. The city lights cast long, distorted shadows across the bed, painting us in shades of gray and blue. I lay curled against Marcus's side, my head resting on his chest, listening to the steady, powerful thud of his heart, the heart that wasn't failing, the heart that belonged to me. I felt a wave of vulnerability wash over me, a sudden piercing clarity in the aftermath of the passion. I traced the scars on his arm with my fingertips, feeling a swell of emotion that terrified me with its intensity. It wasn't just gratitude. It wasn't just lust. I love you, I whispered into the darkness, the words sounding small and fragile in the vast room. I didn't do this for the money, Marcus. You have to know that. The money. It's just paper. It's just a bonus. I lifted my head to look at him, needing him to understand the depth of my commitment. I couldn't breathe in this house before you, I confessed, my voice trembling. I was suffocating. You saved me. I don't care about the billions if I don't have you. You're the only real thing in my world. I poured my soul out to him, offering him every secret part of myself, laying my weapons down at his feet. I wanted him to know that we were partners, equals, accomplices bound by blood and secrecy. I wanted him to see that I was his, completely and irrevocably. Marcus didn't say it back. He didn't offer a flowery declaration of eternal devotion. He simply tightened his arm around me, pulling me closer, and kissed my forehead with a lingering, solemn gravity. To me, in my euphoric state, that silence was better than words. It was the strong, silent assurance of a protector. I settled back into the pillows that had supported Arthur's head for a decade, and let my eyes drift shut. Exhaustion, heavy and warm, pulled at my limbs. I felt safe. I felt protected. I felt victorious. I thought about the morning to come, imagining the phone call from the hospital, the somber voice of the doctor delivering the news that Arthur had passed away in the night. I imagined the freedom of the funeral, the reading of the will where I would inherit an empire. But mostly, I imagined the rest of my life with the man beside me. I drifted into sleep with a smile on my lips, my hand resting over Marcus's heart, utterly convinced that the nightmare was over and the dream was just beginning. I slept the deep, dreamless sleep of the innocent, unaware that the man holding me was wide awake, staring into the dark with eyes that were cold, clear, and terrifyingly alert. Morning did not arrive with the soft, lingering kiss of a lover or the gentle promise of a new life that I had fallen asleep imagining. Instead, it smashed into the room with the violent, screeching sound of heavy velvet curtains being ripped open. I was torn from the depths of a satisfied sleep, my eyes flying open to be instantly assaulted by a blinding, aggressive white light that flooded the suite. I flinched, shielding my face with a hand that felt heavy and sluggish, blinking rapidly as the world tried to resolve itself into focus. The silhouette standing at the foot of the bed blocked out the sun, a looming monolith against the window. My first instinct, fueled by the memory of the night's passion, was to smile. I stretched my limbs under the silk sheets, ready to greet Marcus, ready to pull him back down into the warmth with me. But as my vision cleared, the smile died on my lips, freezing into a rictus of confusion. The man standing there was Marcus, yes, but he was not the naked, vulnerable lover who had held me hours ago. He was fully dressed, immaculately groomed, and wearing his tactical security uniform. Every button was fastened, every crease was sharp, and the gun on his hip looked terrifyingly heavy. His face was a mask of stone, stripped of all the emotion and intimacy I had projected onto it. He looked at me not with love, but with the cold, bored indifference of a statue. Before I could form a question, before my brain could process why he was dressed for duty in the bedroom of the man we had just murdered, the sound of a door opening shattered the last remnants of my reality. It wasn't the bedroom door. It was the door to the master bathroom. I turned my head, my neck cracking with the speed of the movement, and my heart stopped beating in my chest. It didn't skip a beat. It simply ceased to function. Walking out of the bathroom, surrounded by a cloud of steam and the scent of expensive sandalwood soap, was Arthur. He was wrapped in a plush white towel, his hair wet and slicked back, his face glowing with the ruddy health of a man who had just enjoyed a vigorous morning shower. There was no pallor of death. There was no clutching at his chest. There was no corpse rotting in the wine cellar. He was alive. He was undeniably, robustly, terrifyingly alive. He looked fresher and more energized than I had seen him in years, moving with a spring in his step that mocked the memory of the trembling invalid I had tormented the night before. The scream that rose in my throat died there, strangled by a shock so profound it felt like physical paralysis. I scrambled backward, pushing myself up against the headboard, clutching the sheet to my chest as if the thin fabric could protect me from the ghost walking toward me. Arthur didn't look at me with anger. He didn't look at me with the betrayal of a husband who has discovered his wife's infidelity. He looked at me with a mild, detached amusement, the way one might look at a hamster running on a wheel. He walked over to the antique writing desk near the window, picked up a thick manila folder, and tossed it onto the bed. It landed near my feet with a heavy, dull thud that echoed like a gavel strike in the silent room. "Good morning, Alice," he said, his voice calm, steady, and utterly devoid of the wheezing frailty he had affected for months. "I trust you slept well. It's important to be well rested when you're packing." He began to dress, dropping the towel and stepping into his underwear with a casual comfort that made the scene even more surreal. I couldn't speak. I could only stare at him, my mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land, my mind hemorrhaging as it tried to reconcile the image of the dying man in the cellar with the vibrant predator standing before me. You're dead," I whispered finally, the words sounding insane even to my own ears. "I saw you. We left you." Arthur chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that lacked any warmth. He pulled on his trousers, buttoning them with steady hands that I had thought were shaking with palsy just yesterday. "You saw what you wanted to see, my dear. You saw a narrative you were desperate to believe." He walked over to the mirror, adjusting his tie, speaking to my reflection rather than turning to face me. "My heart is in excellent condition, Alice. My cholesterol is lower than yours. The palpitations, the shortness of breath, the fainting spell in the cellar? It was theater. All of it. I've always thought I had a bit of a knack for the dramatic arts, don't you think?" He turned then, his eyes locking onto mine, hard and glittering like diamonds. "I didn't hire Marcus 3 days ago. Marcus has been my head of security for 15 years. He runs my operations in Europe. I brought him here for a specific assignment. You." The revelation hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. I looked at Marcus, standing silent and immobile at the foot of the bed. He didn't blink. He didn't look ashamed. He just stood there, a paid actor in the most expensive play ever produced. Arthur continued, his voice taking on the lecture hall cadence he used during board meetings. He explained the economics of loyalty with a brutal simplicity. Marcus wasn't a rogue element. He was an asset. He was paid a salary that exceeded the GDP of a small island nation specifically to be incorruptible, to be the perfect tool for whatever task Arthur required. You thought you seduced him? Arthur asked, a sneer curling his lip. You thought you turned him against me with your charm and your body? Alice, please. You were a job. A slightly more hands-on assignment than usual, I admit, but a job nonetheless. He gestured to the folder on the bed. The prenuptial agreement. Clause 44, Section B. The fidelity clause. If you cheated, you got nothing. But I didn't want to just catch you in bed with someone. That's boring. That's pedestrian. I wanted to know who you were. I wanted to know what was rotting underneath that pretty skin. He walked closer to the bed, leaning in until his face was inches from mine. I wanted to know if you were just a gold digger, or if you were a killer. Now I know. The cruelty of the trap was breathtaking. It wasn't just about saving his fortune. It was about exposing my soul. He had orchestrated the entire scenario, the fake weakness, the pills that were just sugar, the tension, the opportunity. He had handed me the gun, aimed it at his own chest, and waited to see if I would pull the trigger. And I had. I hadn't just pulled it. I had laughed while I did it. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I looked at Marcus again, searching for a crack in the armor, a flicker of the passion we had shared in the dark. Marcus, I choked out, tears finally spilling over my lashes. Tell him about last night. You said. I trailed off, the memory of my own confessions of love burning in my throat like acid. I had poured my heart out to this man. I had told him he was my savior. I had planned a life with him. Surely that couldn't have been fake. The sweat, the desperation, the way he held me, that had to be real. Marcus finally moved. He shifted his weight, the leather of his holster creaking in the silence. He didn't look at me with pity. He didn't look at me with regret. He looked at his sleeve, where a microscopic piece of lint had settled, and brushed it off with a sharp, dismissive flick of his gloved hand. That gesture destroyed me more than any word could have. It was a gesture of absolute, sanitary indifference. I was less than the lint. I was dirt he was wiping off his uniform now that the shift was over. He looked up past me directly at Arthur. The car is waiting downstairs, sir. The team is ready to sweep the room. His voice was the same deep rumble that had whispered treason in my ear, but now it was stripped of all humanity. It was the voice of a machine reporting to its operator. He stepped aside, opening the bedroom door for Arthur, holding it with the deferential posture of a servant who knows exactly where his bread is buttered. Arthur checked his watch, the same predictable gesture I had seen 1,000 times. You have 5 minutes, Alice, he said, checking the time with a bored expression. Take whatever personal items you can fit in one suitcase. The jewelry stays. The clothes I bought you stay. Security will escort you to the curb. He paused at the door, looking back at me one last time. There was no triumph in his face, only a weary disappointment, as if he had hoped I might surprise him, might prove to be better than he expected, but knew I never would. You thought you were a player in the game, he said softly. You thought you were the hunter. But you never understood the ecosystem, my dear. You were never the hunter. You were just the food. He turned and walked out, Marcus falling into step behind him, the two men moving in perfect, synchronized lockstep, united by power and money, leaving me alone in the wreckage of my own ambition. I sat there for a moment, the silence of the room pressing in on me, heavier than it had ever been. The white light of the morning felt cold now, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, the only things in this room that were free. 5 minutes. I had 5 minutes to erase 2 years of my life. I stood up, my legs trembling, and walked to the closet. I didn't reach for the designer gowns or the silk scarves. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely zip the suitcase. I grabbed a pair of jeans from my old life, a sweater, a pair of sneakers. I looked at the jewelry box on the vanity, the glittering diamonds that I had thought were my armor. They were just shackles. I left them. I left everything. As I walked out of the penthouse, flanked by 2 junior security guards who looked at me with open contempt, I didn't cry. I felt a strange hollow lightness. I was walking away with nothing but the clothes on my back and the crushing absolute understanding of my own nature. I had tried to eat the rich, but I had choked. The elevator doors closed, cutting off the view of the golden cage. And as the numbers ticked down toward the street, toward the noise and the dirt and the reality, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I was exactly where I belonged.